Okay, hello and welcome to our fourth panel of the day, and what I'm humbly entitling the Fellowship of the Ring of our Making Comics trilogy. So we've got three panels over the course of the weekend in which we're going to be looking at everything from the practicalities of making a comic to shipping and distribution to marketing, the real kind of nitty gritty. And getting us started here today, we're going to be looking at actually making the thing, which is the name of the panel. Now, I'd like to welcome Nick and Steve up here, but also Siân, who has stepped in at the last minute, very, very last minute. I mean,
like 2 minutes ago.
As in 2 minutes ago. I'm improving slightly on from when I press ganged PJ into appearing on a panel, which is a very weird tongue twister. But thank you all for joining us, some on very short notice. Starting the trend. Continuing the trend that we started earlier, could you each introduce yourselves? Nick.
I feel like I've already done a lot of that.
But in case there's any new people.
Okay, well, I'm Nick. I've been drawing comics for about 12 years since I did illustration at university. I make a book called Seven String and a book called Catamaran. And in recent years, me, John, Alice and Lucy all teamed up to form Big Punch Studios, who all create comics together, especially a quarterly magazine called Extraversal.
I'm Steve. Most of you will if you know me, you'll be familiar with me as the face of Time Bomb Comics, which I've been doing since 2007. From a creative perspective, I'm the writer of Flintlock, which is an ongoing series. I've been involved in comics for a long time. Someone recently described me as a veteran of British indie comics, which I was really impressed with, and I realised it meant I was old.
My name is Siân Jefferson. I am not Anastasia Catras. I've been making comics for just under 5 years. I guess the most well-known thing I've worked on is my Adventures of Sush series, which is pretty much just dumb stories about my cat. But other people really like that, so that's what I make. And that's pretty much my entire introduction, because, again, 2 minutes, John.
I did stress in the build-up to even our long-running panel members that no preparation was needed, so there's no excuses.
None has happened.
There's no excuses. Now, again, Nick, you've already kind of told us some of this in previous panels, but so I'm going to pass over you.
Sure,
this moment.
Please do.
But Steve, can you remember what was your gateway, if you will? What kind of started you down this path into making comics?
It was. I've been involved in comics a long time, since the 1980s. I'd actually started creating comics in the late 80s, early 90s. I got my first professional sales in the early 90s. And then through personal circumstance I had a day job which then gave me an opportunity to move abroad. So I decided to do that. I moved abroad and I spent the next 13, 14 years working overseas in various countries. When I came back to the UK, I still followed comics all through that time, but as a reader rather than a creator. So I'd kind of got away from the whole creating kind of side of things. And then I came back to the UK in early, I think it was 2002, 2003. And a couple of years later, I found myself living in Leicester. And I saw an advert for, it was the very first Birmingham International Comics Show. The first BIX that took place in 2006. I think it was just before Christmas, 2006. And it's the first convention I'd been to, I'd seen for ages. I used to go to them all in the 80s, all being there just one a year. So I went to that one in Birmingham, and I went there. It was the first I'd been to a con for ages. And there was loads of kind of indie books and indie creators that I'd never heard of. Now, I remembered when I'd seen indie creators at conventions before, and they were all lovely people, but all the books were always these kind of hand-stapled, photocopied, very rough, very ready, lots of kind of willingness, but more ambition than ability, okay? And suddenly there was all these comics which were just absolutely mind-blowing. They could easily sit alongside anything else that was available on the shelves of the comic shop. And I hoovered them up over the course of the convention. I came away with a big stack of these books. But more importantly, I also came back with a determination that, I want to come back to this show next year and I want to be behind the table with my own comic. And that's what I did. So over the next year, I then put together a one-shot comic book with an old artist friend that I knew back from the 80s, and we put a comic together, and I was at then the 2007 Big Show, and that was when I first started the whole Time Bomb Comics thing, which has led me to where I am now. So that was my start.
And Siân?
It's nowhere near that impressive. I think I probably got my start in comics after I finished my degree. I studied 2D animation for about 5 years, which was super fun. And then I got out of uni and was like, no, don't want to do that. For about 2 years, I worked as a storyboard artist and a designer. And during that time, Sarah Millman, who everybody here knows by now, we were both hi. We were both working at a games company together, and obviously Sarah had spent her masters working on the Hard Time, which many of you are familiar with, and I didn't do comics at my masters, I did animation. And I'd sort of started dabbling in comics because I was working in storyboarding and they're quite closely related. And Sarah approached me and really politely basically said, I'm going to this convention and I'm terrified, do you want to come with? And I was like, yeah, that doesn't sound frightening at all. And it was Cardiff. Is it Cardiff? Yeah. Yeah, it was Cardiff. So it wasn't a huge convention, but also kind of the first time I'd ever been in any situation like that. And it kind of went well. So we were like, great, okay, we'll do another one. And I think we did 2 other events that year. And at the same time, I was being mentored by a storyboard artist who did a lot of work with American companies. And after about a year of going to conventions, I had this really weird sort of moment where I was like, I think I like it more than storyboarding. So now I have to tell this guy that I don't want to be mentored anymore. And I thought he wasn't going to take it very well, but he actually was very much like, well, that's what you want to do. You've got a lot of work to do, but you can do it. So I pretty much just quit my design job and was like, great, okay, I'm going to go make comics. So the short version of this story is, it's all Sarah's fault.
That could be the takeaway message from the entire show, I feel, actually.
Yeah.
Well, growing up, and maybe as we kind of read comics and build a desire to, make them, maybe I think we touched upon this earlier, there's sometimes an idea that comics kind of spring fully formed out of the air. Like, Nick, I was wondering if you can cast your mind back to the first comic you made, or maybe like the first comic you put out into the world.
Yeah.
And maybe you can tell us a little bit about it, and what was that experience like?
Okay, Nikki, you might have to help me a bit with this, because the first comic I ever made was with you at uni, and it was that anthology we put together. Was it Choose? We had a theme. Guess, that was it. That's right. So it all started because a friend of ours at the uni was like, I'm going to get a couple of tables, or one table, don't quite know what it was, for this web and mini comics thing in London, which was a tiny little show back then. You should all get a comic together. This was like maybe a month or 2 before the event.
It was like 2 weeks before the con.
Was it even that?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it was ridiculous. Tiny time frame. We should all go, we should all be behind this table, and we should put a comic together. So I'd never made a comic before other than the sort of sketchy stuff that Nikki and I had done and put up on the walls of our house that we lived in. So we were like, okay, we're not each going to make a full comic in that time. We can't do that. So instead, me, Nikki, and our other friend Matt decided that we'd sort of all do one together, and we'd essentially create a little anthology, and it would just have a theme. And the theme was Guess. Don't know how we came up with that. And then we'd all do a story in that, and then we would just use all of our photocopying credits that we have with the university to just print as many copies as we could, staple them together ourselves, and take them.
Nick, it wasn't even stapled together.
Was it not?
It was printed on A3 and then folded it.
So it was just loose.
It was an A4 book.
So So it's like the books that you used to see. They were potentially worse than that.
Barely even a book. By the sound of it.
I think I had a double page spread. That was I think both of us, or each of us only had a double page spread, and there was a cover, back cover. That was about it. And mine was themed around a warrior trying to find a princess, and then the joke was he had to guess which castle she was in, and it was kind of a riff on the Mario thing because it turned out she was in another castle. That was literally the extent of the comic. It was definitely awful. Like, there's no question. I think that I didn't think I really had any like speech in it. Like, narrative flow would have just been an absolute mess. Like, I had no understanding of how to make the craft of making a comic and making it readable. And I was then faced with a double page spread, and I think I probably broke all sorts of stupid rules in making that. And then we rocked up to this show, and we just tried to sell as many as we could, and we hardly sold any, if I remember rightly, because it probably looked really bad, and we were completely unknown. And why would anyone buy it? But I do remember that the experience of knowing that we'd made something and that it was there on the table, and that people were flicking through it and were talking to you about it, and I was like, I love this. Next time I'm gonna have my own, and that was it really.
And so, Steve, like, now you're coming at this as a writer.
Yes.
So how did your experience differ of kind of putting together your first book?
I mean, you mean the first book for Time Bomb, I'm assuming, that's what you mean? Or
Well, I guess the first...
way back.
I think it's like,
when I was, using stone tablets and stuff to write the scripts, those kind of things.
I guess the point at which you could say, I made something to go out into the world, like the moment you were quite happy to kind of say, this is a product I have made and I'm sending it out.
Oh, this would have been back with fanzines and strip scenes in the 80s. When I first started starting to kind of try and write comics. I mean, before then, I tried to kind of write and draw, but I realised very quickly that I was not an artist. It didn't stop me for a while, but and I still have those comics that I used to do, and they were all on grey sugar paper, and it was all in biro. But I quickly realised I was more interested in the actual stories, telling the stories, than actually drawing them at the end of it. So it was when I first started sending stuff to strip scenes, writing scripts, and I remember there was a magazine which some of you may be familiar with in the 80s called Warrior, which was done by Deskin, and this was when people like Alan Moore were first starting to be noticed, the V for Vendetta that first appeared in there, and they had a feature which actually showed how a comic strip was laid out. So that was really useful to kind of see that and to have that understanding of how to lay out a comic strip, and then use that for the pacing. So it was when I started doing those, and they were always short stories, and they were all bloody awful. They really were. But it was a really good learning curve, because what remained constant throughout, that even though the stories themselves maybe weren't that great, and in the strip scenes, for a lot of the time, the art that went with it wasn't that great, but the actual the magic and the sense of awe you get when something which you've written and you've just put into words on a piece of paper is converted into this fully finished, drawn, lettered piece of work. It is astonishing. And that never ever gets old. That never gets old. So even now, today, I think everyone feels the same. Certainly, I think more if you're a writer, because when you're writing something, it's all just in your head. But when someone then converts it into visuals, it's mind blowing. So those are the things that I remember when I started getting into comics and making me realise, oh, this is a great place to be. This is a great thing to do creatively.
And Siân, of course, now you said you were making a transition from storyboard artist to comic book creator. I mean, how was that transition, and how different was the process?
More different than I imagined. I think my first comic was a web comic, because I didn't know what I was doing. I still have no idea what I'm doing most of the time.
Neither do any of us.
Exactly. And I think I thought that it would be much easier to sort of just transfer my skills as a storyboard artist over to being a comic artist, mainly because I was like, it's drawings in sequence. It's entirely a storyboard artist's job. But then obviously it was kind of like the reverse. You have to write it and actually have a story put together, and it has to be good. And then there were all kinds of things that I didn't really preempt as well, like obviously setting things up for print later when I moved off of webcomics, and colouring. God, that is time consuming. Oh my gosh. Oh, as a storyboard artist, you don't colour anything. Everybody wants you to colour anything. They barely want you to use a pen. So that was an interesting sort of jump. But like I said earlier, the more I worked on comics, the more I enjoyed it, and discovered that I liked it more than storyboarding because I had more control over the story, and I could decide what the characters were doing instead of have someone come in and go, here's a script that is barely put together. Can you change it into an animated children's program about, I don't know, hedgehogs or whatever it was? And you're just like, this is mind-numbingly unengaging. So, yeah, I think it was an interesting experience and taught me how woefully underprepared I was for comics. Just so underprepared.
But I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, like you get a lot of kind of like how-to guides, people often say things you should do. What is like a big mistake you made? Can you remember something you got very wrong?
Yes, loads of things. But the biggest one is probably when I did actually write something out way too long. And I, again, was coming at it from a storyboarding angle where I was like, sure, yeah, I could probably do that in 3 months. 5 years later, finally finished that. And I was like, ooh, okay. And I just hadn't anticipated how much work it would be to translate this not huge document over into a comic that didn't just need to be drawn, it needed inking and lettering, and you had to actually be able to read the font, because I did not pick a good font for that one. And then you have to colour it all, and obviously there's flat colour, and then you have to go in and put the details in. So a process that I sort of imagined taking, like I said, 3 months, just drew out. And at the time I was doing it around other jobs as well. So that was, yeah, pretty much once I'd finished the first maybe 2 chapters of that, I was like, right, everything is at a maximum of 25 pages. If it's longer than that, cut it out. It doesn't need to be in there. So editing, it taught me a lot about editing.
And Steve, I mean, particularly with having to liaise, I mean, you know, you are an editor as well. You are, you know, you collect and work with a lot of different creators. I mean, what were some big hurdles or mistakes that you faced?
I guess it's really when people have created something, or you're creating yourself, and you've forgotten the mechanics of comics. You must always keep the mechanics of comics in the forefront of your mind, especially when you're talking about something which you think you realise is going to be printed. So understanding how the pages are going to be turned, and how the turning of the pages can impact on the storytelling. With things like making sure that if you've got a splash page, making sure apart from it being on page 1, it should always be on an even page. So when you turn the page, then it pops out. It's those kind of mechanics, and if you're describing what goes on in a panel, remembering that description should be a snapshot of a moment, not a before, during, and after moment. And these things, because I get a lot of submissions through, and time again, it's those kind of things which you see people are kind of forgetting about. So that you'll have descriptions of a single panel, and there's no way the best artist in the world could actually draw that in a single panel. So it's about understanding how comics work and using that to drive your storytelling. And that's a key thing. And lettering. Oh my God, lettering is such an important thing. I had a bit of a mini rant yesterday on Facebook, which some of you might have seen. I received a comic through the post, which it was a Kickstarter that I backed, and it's a beautiful looking comic, absolutely lovely. The art is really nice. The colouring is so subtle. The actual concept is terrific, but the lettering is absolutely dreadful throughout, and it's almost like it was seen as a bit of an afterthought. We've done all this other stuff really nicely. Let's just stick the lettering on there anyhow, and it completely destroys the experience of reading that comic. So it's when you're producing a comic, especially when you're producing the whole comic, to give as much care and attention as to perhaps the perceived fun parts of writing and drawing it as the other parts as well, you know, the lettering, the formatting, the pagination, the format, the marketing, all those kind of things are such it's equally, if not more important than the fun writing and drawing part.
For me, probably one of the biggest, most significant mistakes I think I made was in the early days of 7-string, I was releasing them as individual sort of floppies, and I decided to go A ratio because I thought that would make things simple from a printing perspective, cheap from a printing, and I wanted to go full colour, large A4. That's what I wanted to do, which was ambitious and expensive, but went with it anyway. And I did a few tracks, and then, as I called them, I called my issues tracks because it's a musical comic. And then, awesomely, amazingly, I got picked up by a tiny little publisher in Canada, and they wanted to collect the first 3 issues into a graphic novel. But they sort of, through various stupid contract negotiations and requirements on their part, they wanted it to be a very specific size and shape format, which was completely off any standard graphic novel size, even American graphic novel size, not A ratio. It's just this whole other thing. So I had to resize every single page that I'd created already of my artwork down to this sort of thinner than A5 weird ratio. But I flattened all the artwork and saved it all in this new format, thinking, well, A, cutting corners, trying to do it as quickly as I could, and B, thinking, well, it doesn't matter because this is the form it will take now, this is the comic now, so that's fine, this is what it is, I'll just continue to make new artwork from that point. Unfortunately, the publisher then changed their mind midway through the run of the first sort of size and were like, actually, it'd be really cool if it was a kind of larger format. And I was like, larger format but same ratio? Fingers crossed? No, it would be a completely different ratio. Now it was a wider page and a taller book, so it almost ended up weirdly square. So I was like, oh God, what have I done? Oh no. So I artificially added new bleeds to all the artwork. So I went back into every single page, and I now artificially grew it. But of course the work wasn't layered anymore. All the lettering and everything was flattened into the artwork. And because of it, the way it was now cropped, like speech bubbles were disappearing off the trim of the page and off the bottom of it as well. It was a massive nightmare. So I resized it all again, and he was like, yeah, that's great. And then we ran a few copies of that, and then I decided I wanted to leave that publisher behind. So then I was like, oh God, now what? You know, now am I faced with changing format again? And there had been these amazing fans along the way who had bought the book multiple times. So they bought it as individual issues, then they bought it as this weird tiny thin ratio, then they bought it again at this large ratio because they wanted to make sure that all of their volumes were all the same size, obviously. So they were always making sure that their volume 1 was always going to be the one that I was going to stick with. And I was like, but I don't want to stick with this weird square large format now either, because I went and talked to loads of printers, because obviously I had to print it myself now. And they were like, well, I don't know what that is. That's going to cost you at least like £600-700 more per run of books because you've got this weird shape and it's got to be artificially cut for every page. And I was like, oh no. So I'm stuck there. 7-string, volume 3 coming out this year, hopefully, is now at this weird format, and it's locked there, despite the fact that volume 2 and volume 3 I've learned a lot of lessons, and all my artwork is still completely layered and free, and the bleed's much larger, and all this kind of stuff. It's all kind of irrelevant, because I don't want to mess people around who've already bought volume 1. I want to make sure that every book I subsequently release is the same size on their bookshelf, and it looks like a complete collection. But it does mean now that every print run I do of the old volumes and the ones to come are locked at this ridiculous ratio, all because of that publisher messing me around, and partly because I screwed up and flattened all my artwork. So yeah, just don't go flattening artwork. Keep all your editable files, and don't lock into any sort of format at all, because that's the biggest mistake. And from now on, I'm keeping very, very open-minded with format.
You say no, presumably, to publishers.
Oh, I'm done with publishers. I'm done with publishers now. Yeah, self-publishing all the way. Yeah, screw
It's a
it.
shame, because I had this idea for a triangular format.
It's bunting, basically, just hanging.
I worry that one thing these mics will never be able to capture is the little murmur of anxiety that went through the room when you said you flattened all the letters.
Oh God, yeah. It was a palpable, like, lightning strike through the room, wasn't it? Oh God, no.
Yeah.
I was so naive back then. That was such a whoopsie. I won't do that again.
I feel like it's like when you're growing up, the one thing they never teach you at school is how to use credit cards or open a bank account or useful stuff. And I can say this because he's now left the building, but no one ever taught me about bleeds or gutters. No. And I'm wondering, like, at what point did these arcane terms such as like DPI, bleed?
I'll tell you when, John. It's when your publisher forces you in a stupid format. That's when it happens. Yeah, I think it's the first time you get really serious with your printing. Basically, I think.
Yeah. You have to, otherwise what you'll end up with will be like what you've experienced, won't it?
Yeah.
It's part of. I mean, the thing is, the key part of it is people like Rich. There's also Stuart as well, who a lot of people use. A printer that has a personal interest in what you're doing, they will take the time and effort to get back to you if there's any issues and help you understand the process. Because a lot of these things, you don't know them initially, and a lot of printers will just hit that print button, and what you'll get will be an absolute disaster. But at the same time, things like bleeds, it is a really difficult thing for a lot of people to seem to understand, because I send when I'm working with artists, I send them bleed templates, so they can use. And I think they might come from someone like Rich or something. I know that some people they do send them out. And even when they have a template and a guideline, which is quite clear on how to lay out a page, there still tends to be problems. So for some reason, it does seem to be something which some people get, some people find it really difficult to get. But it's really worthwhile investing that time to get it right, because it makes a huge difference and it solves headaches for everyone involved further down the line.
Sure.
Well, I was just going to add to that. You also really, really don't want to be dealing with an angry printer. Just get it right and take their advice. Because I think the way that I learnt about it was I sent something to, I think it might have been Rich or possibly someone else, and I think it was so obvious to them that I didn't know what I was doing that they very kindly explained it to me. And pretty much since then, whenever I make anything that I know is going to go to print, I go to Rich's website and just download all his templates, because it kind of guarantees you're going to get it right, and if you do get it wrong, he's going to help you. But again, just don't piss him off.
Yeah,
So.
But I think as well, that's one of the things that really kind of highlights how I think the comics community in the UK is very different from a lot of other creative communities. There is this willingness to provide assistance and help and support and guidance, without it necessarily being a monetary return back. People are very happy to provide guidance and advice. The fact that you've got Rich and he's put templates on his website that you can download and use, even if you're not going to actually use his printing service, says a lot about Rich, of course, but it also says a lot about how our community works together. And I think that's one of the things that when you're starting out, when you're making something for the first time, just don't be afraid to tap into that available fountain of knowledge.
Yeah, you're not on your own, basically.
Yeah, the great thing that I found about our community is, aside from the fact that everyone is kind of an introvert and very nice, everyone's very invested in each other's success as well, and it's unusual but really nice, because essentially it means that you're always pulling each other up. Rarely do you come across someone who's trying to cut other people down to make themselves seem better.
Definitely.
And I don't think that's especially common in other sort of industries, but then again, I don't know for sure. It's just, it really struck me when I went into comics that everyone was like, oh, well, I want this to work out for you. Not that I'm going to get anything from it, but I want it to work for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome.
I'm interested to know when you each made the decision to start telling a story and bringing it to life as a physical thing. What thoughts went through your head about format? By which I mean, and how did that differ from your perception and reality? By which I mean, were you thinking a comic is a spine-stapled, floppy as you describe, or a comic is a graphic novel and is thicker, or even if it's a webcomic?
That's a question.
I think the first time I really thought about format was when I had an idea for a book that I wanted to make. This was back before I started like the big projects I'm working on now, like 7 String and stuff like that. But I used to do these very much one-off short sort of sci-fi vignettes sort of comic. I'd just have an idea, and it would maybe between 8 and 16, 20 pages long, and it would be self-contained, and then I would move on to the next sort of brainstorm I had a few weeks later or whatever. And I had this one idea that it was going to be about psychics. It wasn't about psychics, and it was about a meeting between two psychics whose entire future plays out inside their heads in the first second that they meet. And so what I really wanted to do with the pages is each double page spread would be the lady's head and the fella's head, and they'd be looking at each other across the gutter of the page, and all the panels would be inside the shapes of their heads, so it's like a sort of profile shots of them looking at each other. And so it's kind of like this like double page spread by double page spread mental conversation between the two of them as their whole lives flashed ahead to an inevitable sort of end, and then they realised that they were actually kind of made for each other, and that was the thinking. But I realised that wouldn't work because it's the sort of shape of a head on like an A5 or an A ratio sheet. So what I really wanted to do was have square pages, so it would end up being a square book with like 2 squares as a double page spread. And that really opened my eyes, because when I wanted to do that, I then thought, well, I'm going to have to get this printed. And so for the first time ever, rather than just diving straight into drawing, I was like, okay, I'm going to go to a printer first and say, I want to do this. Is that possible? Because this was one of my first comics, I didn't even know. And they basically explained to me that they would print it A3 and then they would chop it down. But then there had to be considerations about where the staples would fall in their machines that they had. And so I'd end up probably only having 1 staple in it. Was I okay with this? And if I wasn't, then I'd have to pay a bit more to organise all that stuff out. And so that was really, really interesting, because it for the first time, it opened my eyes to the fact that I had to think about this before I went in. And also the processes by which stuff gets printed was actually integral to the creation of the book, which it all worked out in the end. It was actually really cool. I was really happy with it. But yeah.
Okay, I guess to me, it's thinking about the story and if the format would benefit the story. That's a key thing for me. So if I sign any new book on from another creative team, right at the start, I'm thinking of how best suited that finished product would be as a comic. And the best example of that was a few years ago. I'd put out a comic called A Long Ship, which was a 56-page complete story. And it was a very unusual story. So because of that, I was thinking, how can I make the whole package unusual compared to the kind of the standard comic book size?
So you went triangle, I assume. Yeah.
No, I went sphere. So I did it as square. So it was the size of a single. Do they still have vinyl singles these days, or is it all? Yeah, they still have those. Yeah. So that kind of format. So we decided the format before we actually started creating the pages. So we had that format in mind. Then going forwards, then all the art direction and the page direction and the script editing was based around the finished format that it was going to be produced in, and it worked really successfully for that book, and it did make it stand out. So that was a case where, yeah, the format really kind of mattered in terms of the story. But ultimately, it is, you do tend to stick to those same kind of formats, because I think that's what people almost expect. In the same way, if you're publishing a novel, you tend to publish a novel in a certain kind of ratio, and there's lots of different kind of reasons for that. One of the reasons, of course, is just makes it easier for shops and bookshops and that to carry it if it is in that format. So it is okay. It's one thing kind of trying to do something a bit quirky and thinking outside the box, but also think of that bigger picture. How much of a problem is that finished kind of article going to be from a kind of a retailer perspective? Because that has a bearing as well, I think.
I agree with what you're saying, and what to back up what you mean. When I printed my first book, and I did it through Kickstarter, I did it extra big size. But when I went to an event where the distributor was carrying it, they had the new ones, which are smaller size, and the old one. But the old one, which is the bigger size, was on the so the new ones were facing out because it fitted on the shelves. The other ones were too tall to fit on shelves, so they were on top of each other, so you couldn't see the book at all. It was completely lost. So if you try and do something clever, that's going to be extra big, the back might backfire and all your books are stacked up with just the spine because you can't put the front out because the dig's on the shelf.
True.
Thank you for your question, by the way. I actually wanted to, with time considerations in mind, I know I appreciate we are racing through this, but did we have any more questions from the audience before I carry on waffling? I have a question.
How do you deal with that moment when you're sort of halfway through a book? It's not out there yet, but it's like, what, you haven't got any feedback on it. How do you deal with having spent 6 months or a year working hard on that, and yet you can't?
That is really, really hard.
Because I know you struggle with that.
Yeah, because after, especially if you're working and you're not releasing issues, and instead you're just making a graphic novel or something, then it's like that Kickstarter plateau. It's like the middle where everything starts to sag a little bit, and you're a bit like, I'm sat in this darkened room producing this thing, and I think people are going to want it. I'm excited to produce. Maybe it's a sequel, maybe it's the next volume in a series or something. But some people maybe like the first one, so that I think they're going to like this. But I don't have anything to show them yet, and I can't show them half of it, and I can't like prematurely release what I've got either. And it gets harder and harder page by page to sort of carry on, I guess. But that's one of the biggest things that made me switch to a model where I'm releasing the pages I create every week as a web comic, essentially, only to collect it all at the end into a graphic novel. And that not only spurs me on because I get like engagement from people like commenting on the pages as I go, and it also gives me a deadline every week. I've got to meet that demand for, they're expecting a page each week. But also it sort of services two groups of people, those who want to just read stuff online, and then at the end, I don't feel like I've been working in a vacuum the entire time because I've been kept going by people reading it as I go. So.
Yeah, it's super hard, and I'm actually doing that right now. I'm halfway through finishing a book, and like Nick said, you are essentially working in a vacuum, and you can't show people a half-finished book and be like, isn't it great? So I guess in terms of dealing with that, I have a handful of people who work in our industry or who are just my friends who I will show stuff to, and generally they're people who, if it doesn't make sense or it doesn't look good or the lettering's off or whatever, they're going to give me that feedback without me having to put it on the internet and be like, please don't hate it. So that's generally how I deal with it, but obviously you still have to deal with those long periods of time where you're kind of like, it's been 6 weeks and somehow I've only managed to produce 10 pages. And that really just requires a lot of willpower, push through that whole I haven't left my house in 5 days kind of thing. But yeah, I think having a small group of people that you can show something to and they're going to give you honest feedback, and they're not going to go, yeah, it looks fine, and you're kind of like, I know it doesn't, there's something wrong with this page, really helps spur you on when you're not getting that weekly sort of feedback from your Instagram or your Tumblr or wherever you post things where people are liking it or saying, oh, this is really good, I'm looking forward to next week. So it's kind of a smaller version of the motivation from a group of people that you trust not to be like, it's awful, what are you doing with your life? So.
Okay, well, for me, because I'm not doing comics purely from a creator side. I'm also doing the whole editor publisher marketing kind of thing. I've got multiple things going on at the same time, so it's almost because I'm not working on any one single thing in isolation. Sometimes I wish I was, because it's a real juggling act sometimes. But on the plus side, it's almost like you're not conscious of the fact that you can't show people this yet because you've got this coming up shortly, and you can show something from that. So it's keeping, for me, the challenge is keeping those multiple balls going in the air. But at the same time, there's key people which I've got to know over the years, and I share with them regularly a kind of updates on what I'm doing, and share with them some of the ideas I have, some of the work in process coming together, just to get their reaction. The stuff I write myself, I get another editor to actually edit it as well, because I think that's a really important thing to do, rather than kind of self-edit, because when you try and self-edit, you're just too close to that piece of work, and it's really useful to get someone who isn't close to it, who can actually look at it objectively and make some interesting, judgment calls on it. So I don't really get that kind of same sense of, I've got nothing to show people. There always seems to be something that I'm concentrating on that I can share with people as I'm working forward.
Well, I guess if we're going to try and finish close to on time, I'm going to maybe bring this down to one last question. I was wondering if you could each share, we talked about mistakes you made. I was wondering if each of you could talk about one amazing experience you had working on a project, of bringing something to life.
I could go first, if you want. Yeah. Sort of playing into the biggest mistake I made being a formatting one. I feel like one of my biggest successes was also a formatting success. Recently, we produced a quarterly magazine together, and this year's worth of episodes is all going to be a massive sort of crossover event where all the stories that are featured within it, as well as some of our other stories, all interlink. And as such, we had the idea of making all the covers, once printed, all form one long image, which a lot of comics do. Like, I know the Star Wars comics do it a lot, and whenever they're doing a sort of big run or a self-contained series of maybe 4 or 5 books, it's quite a common thing in the comic industry. Well, not a common thing, but like a special thing that occurs from time to time, where if you collect them all, you get this awesome long piece of artwork. So we were like, yeah, let's give that a shot. And it turned out to be a lot harder than you'd think, because over a year, we produce the covers as we go. So this meant producing the covers kind of all at once, I suppose, and then splitting it up. And it was thinking really carefully about things like bleeds and where those bleeds fall, because it was a cover. Obviously, you don't bleed into the spine, but you do bleed the other way. And so then making sure that post-trim, then faced with another cover, your bleeds and trim were all in line then for that to line up. And we did our second issue this year, so that was the first time this concept was going to be proved as to whether it would work or not. And the issue came through, and I immediately rushed to get issue 1 of this year and put issue 2 next to it, and they lined up perfectly. And it was such a good feeling that it was sort of like I'd conquered the demon of what I did with volume 1, and I was like, I understand how this works now. This is cool. This is cool. So it was quite ambitious, and we still have 2 more to go. So fingers crossed, we'll keep that up. But I know how it works now, so I feel pretty confident with that. But I think the resultant 4 issues at the end of the year are going to look pretty cool.
For me, I guess the most amazing thing has been the whole thing I've been doing with the Flintlock series. Because when I first came up with the idea, I really liked it, but I wasn't sure if anyone else would be, because it seemed just maybe a little bit too niche, because it's all set in the 18th century and it all features women as the lead roles rather than the men. And I thought, is this just too personal for me? But what's been amazing for me, how that series has been received, and I got book 3 out next week. And it's the amount of people I've met through it, and people who become emotionally invested in those characters that I've created. Getting cosplayers turn up and they're dressed as your character is just mind blowing. And the first time it happened, I squealed. I genuinely squealed because I couldn't believe it. And there's, the fact that I've signed a licensing agreement for it to be made into a game. There's just like a role-playing game, which is going to be out next year. It just shows that, if I can do it, anyone can do it. All right. But it's brought me so much kind of personal reward in terms of feeling, that I've produced something which is worthwhile. A lot of the stuff I've put out through time hasn't been my work. It's been other people's work, which I've really liked and I've wanted to share with the wider world. But it's kind of it's quite amazing to have something which I'm really interested in, and it seems to find an audience. So that's an amazing thing that's happened for me.
It was really awesome. I think one of the most memorable, awesome things that happened for me was it must have happened in the last couple of years. I got a message from a woman who had bought a copy of my Swoosh book for her daughter who really loves cats. And she sent me this really, really nice message about how much her daughter really loved this book. And she'd showed it to all of her friends, and she'd started drawing cats on everything, including, I think, the wallpaper. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry. Whoops. But she also told me that her daughter and her best friend had turned this into a game that they played in the park, where one of them would be my cat, Swoosh, running around the park, and the other one had to catch it and make friends with them. And it was the cutest thing I'd ever read. And I'm not particularly big on kids because I'm basically a Disney villain. But it really kind of, it sort of sat in my brain for a really long time, and the timing was really great as well because, like we were saying, I was in the middle of working on something where basically I was getting no feedback for maybe a good couple of weeks, and I'd kind of been in the house for a long time, and I'm an introvert anyway, so at this point I was like, everything I'm doing with my life is a huge waste of time. And then I got this message about these kids who really, really loved this book, and they turned it into a game, and like she took it to school and showed all their friends, and I was just like, well, I guess I better keep making these stupid books then. So, but that was really satisfying because I think it was the first time that I really felt like my work had some reach and was important to someone, even if it was just 2 5-year-old girls running around in a park. So, so that was a really, really satisfying moment. And I'm pretty sure I saved that message to my computer. So now when I get a bit bummed out, I'm like, well, there are 2 5-year-olds who think you're great.
Everyone, I think, I hope you'll join me in putting your hands together. A round of applause for our amazing panelists.